The history of human civilization is supposed to be simple. At least, that's what the textbooks say. We begin as scattered hunter-gatherers. Then we learn to farm. Then we accidentally create cities. Then we slowly evolve writing, mathematics, and architecture over thousands of years. That's the official story. But the closer you look, the more the timeline collapses under its own weight. Because the first true civilization didn't arrive slowly. It appeared suddenly, fully formed, with no developmental period behind it. Like someone flipped a switch. Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians. The civilization that seems to come out of nowhere, and then immediately invents everything you're not supposed to invent first. Writing, kingship, courts, irrigation systems, multi-tiered cities, astronomy, timekeeping, advanced mathematics, metalwork, and a class of priests who said they were taught these things by beings who descended from the sky. And this is where the pattern begins, though most historians pretend not to see it. The Sumerians didn't just say gods existed. They said their gods were physical, tangible, present, and they had names, faces, genealogies, rivalries, memories, territories, and technology. They described these beings in the same matter-of-fact tone that modern people describe nations. 7 leading figures, a council, a chain of command, and the name that emerges again and again, carved into the oldest tablets humanity has ever recovered, is simple: the Anunnaki, those who came from above. The earliest clay tablets describe these beings not as mythic archetypes, but as rulers, instructors, overseers. They divide Earth among themselves. They appoint human intermediaries. They teach agriculture, mathematics, and the construction of monumental temples. They choose kings. They encode laws. And then the story takes a turn that the official narrative quietly avoids. Because when the Sumerians talk about their origins, they don't describe a struggle for survival or a long climb out of primitive conditions. They describe a transfer of knowledge, a handover, as if someone arrived at an already intelligent species and accelerated it far beyond what a newly settled farming culture should have been capable of. And this would be easy to dismiss as mythology, if the same story didn't appear again thousands of miles away, among people who were not supposed to have any contact with Mesopotamia at all. People across the ancient world repeat the same essential story. Beings from above, descending with knowledge, dividing territories, teaching humans, and then leaving, or withdrawing behind a veil that only kings and priests could cross. The farther you go from Sumer, the more this pattern strengthens, not weakens. In ancient Egypt, the earliest kings are described as the followers of Horus, a group of non-human rulers who ruled before the first human dynasty. Their reign length? Thousands of years. And just when it seems like Egypt is an outlier, the same problem appears in India. The Vedic texts describe celestial teachers, armed with weapons that behave less like mythology and more like technology. Vimanas, flying craft, astra, energetic weapons. Cosmic beings who interact directly with humanity, guide the earliest kingdoms, and withdraw when humans reach a certain threshold. And if this were only 3 civilizations, it would be interesting but not necessarily world-changing. But then you look at the Maya, the Olmecs, the pre-Inca cultures, the Aboriginal Australians, the Dogon of Mali. And instead of drifting apart, the pattern converges sharply toward one idea: a time when humanity received knowledge from a superior group of beings who were mistaken for gods. And this is the moment where the story stops being merely interesting and starts becoming impossible to ignore. Because whenever you find the earliest version of a civilization, the very first structure, the very first myth, the first astronomical alignment, that's where the Anunnaki pattern emerges. Always at the beginning, never at the middle, never at the end. It's as if the moment humans cross a threshold of population or location, something intervenes, hands them a complete toolkit, and then steps away. Take Göbekli Tepe, built 11,000 years ago, 7,000 years before the pyramids, when hunters and gatherers should not have been building anything. Before agriculture, before pottery, before cities, yet somehow they're carving megalithic pillars, weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles that track celestial events, with a precision that would challenge medieval astronomers. Archaeologists tried to explain it as some sort of communal ritual site, but that explanation falls apart when you notice the carvings. Animals from every direction, symbols that match Sumerian iconography thousands of years before Sumer existed, patterns that suggest a transfer of knowledge, not an independent discovery. And then the story shifts again. Because not only do these beings supposedly teach early humans how to build, plant, and write, they also introduce them to the concept of kingship, not as a human idea, but as something lowered from heaven. That phrase appears on the Sumerian king list, a document so old that parts of it were copied by Babylonian scribes who considered it ancient even in their own time. The king list describes rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years, and normally that would be dismissed as exaggeration. Except the timeline breaks again when a matching list appears in Egypt, listing pre-dynastic rulers with reigns lasting thousands of years. Then the same anomaly appears in China, where the Yellow Emperor and the 5 sovereigns rule for impossibly long spans. Then again in the Vedic timeline, then again in the traditions of Mesoamerica. Different continents, different languages, the same impossible timeline. The longer you study these patterns, the more you realize something is wrong with our understanding of humanity's origin. Because the jumps are too fast, the knowledge is too complete, and the similarities are too exact. Civilizations separated by oceans somehow share the same creation stories, the same flood myths, the same celestial teachers, and the same obsession with Orion, the Pleiades, and Sirius. These are not random stars. They are the 3 star clusters that consistently appear in the oldest astronomical traditions from every corner of the world. And when a pattern repeats that often, you either ignore it or you confront the possibility that ancient humans were responding to something real. One of the most striking details is how the Anunnaki are portrayed in the tablets. Not as formless spirits, but as tall figures with advanced knowledge of metallurgy, medicine, architecture, and astronomy. They argue, they form alliances, they build cities. They have personal names and roles. Enki, the wise one. Enlil, the commander. Ninma, the geneticist. Not titles you assign to clouds or metaphors. The tablets treat them as an active council, with responsibilities that resemble those of an occupying administration. And just when it looks like these beings were purely benevolent, the texts reveal another detail. They disagreed among themselves about how much knowledge humans should have. This tension appears not just in Sumer, but in Egypt, in India, in the stories of the Maya, in the myth of Prometheus. Some beings want humans to advance quickly. Others want humans controlled, limited, or kept in a subordinate role. Over and over, different cultures mirror the same conflict, a faction that uplifts humanity and a faction that restrains them. And in each case, the civilization that emerges afterward reflects which side won. In Sumer, the teachings of Enki encourage writing, irrigation, and mathematics. In Egypt, the teachings of Thoth revolve around astronomy, healing, and architecture. In India, the knowledge given by the Devas produces philosophy, cosmic cycles, and mathematics. In the Andes, Viracocha teaches stonework and astronomy. These beings appear under different names, but their roles remain eerily consistent. They arrive often after a cataclysm, teach a chosen group, and then depart with the promise of returning. But this is where the story deepens. Because ancient cultures didn't just record these beings as visitors, they recorded them as ancestors. Not metaphorically, but literally. Sumerian kings traced their lineage directly to the Anunnaki. Egyptian pharaohs claimed descent from the gods, not in a poetic sense, but in their official genealogies. The Inca claimed their first king was the son of a celestial being who emerged from Lake Titicaca. The Dogon described amphibious sky beings who taught them astronomy that modern science only confirmed in the 20th century. And when researchers looked closer, they found another repeating detail. These ancient gods were obsessed with bloodlines, specific families, specific genetic traits, not the human species as a whole, but a curated lineage. This is the point where the story shifts from archaeological curiosity into something more precise, because the Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki as having a direct hand in the creation or refinement of humanity. The language is uncomfortably literal. They mix the essence of the gods with the beings of earth. That line is older than the Bible, older than Egypt, older than nearly every surviving text. And it's not an isolated detail. The same idea appears in the Book of Enoch, where watchers descend and alter humanity. It appears in the Popol Vuh, where creators mold humans multiple times until they get it right. It appears in Greek mythology, where the gods create humans in stages. It appears in the Vedas, where cosmic beings manipulate early humanity. When cultures invent myths independently, they rarely match this closely. But these aren't metaphors arising at random. They are matching statements from civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. And this is where a new fracture appears, one that most scholars avoid entirely. Because some of these ancient texts describe the beings not only as teachers, but as possessing advanced knowledge of genetics. Sumerian tablets reference the House of Life, a place where divine essence was shaped. Egyptian temple inscriptions describe the Shining Ones, crafting humanity in the House of Gold. The Vedic texts speak of beings with the ability to create or modify life forms, and these descriptions appear not at the end of a civilization's development, when stories would naturally accumulate, but at the very beginning when these people were first forming their identities. Then, the physical anomalies start piling up. Tools found in layers far older than they should exist. Megalithic structures, built with tolerances that modern machines would struggle to replicate. Astronomical alignments that require centuries of observation, yet they appear fully formed at the beginning of each culture. And the farther back you push, the more complete the knowledge appears, as if humans started at the top of the pyramid, not the bottom. When the first city-states emerged, they didn't build tiny huts. They built ziggurats aligned with celestial poles. They built temples encoded with mathematical constants. They created calendars with a complexity inconsistent with a culture just discovering agriculture. They mapped the heavens with a precision that should have taken thousands of years. But instead of developing slowly, they begin with the most advanced version of the system, and the knowledge degrades as time moves forward, not backward. That is the opposite of how learning works, unless the knowledge arrives suddenly and decayed after the teachers left. And this raises a question that no traditional explanation can fully answer. How does every ancient civilization begin with astronomical knowledge pointing at the same regions of the sky? Why Sirius? Why Orion? Why the Pleiades? Why the same star clusters across cultures that supposedly had no contact? This is not a random selection. These are three of the most significant points in ancient mapping systems, and they appear in temples, myths, and alignments around the world. And then you notice something else. These three star clusters are repeatedly associated with the origins or the return of the gods. When you trace the oldest traditions, Sirius is associated with the goddess who brings knowledge. Orion is associated with the god who rules the afterlife or the heavens. And the Pleiades are associated with the Seven Sisters, a group of beings often linked with the creators or instructors of humanity. The number 7 repeats. 7 Anunnaki, 7 sages, 7 rays, 7 builders, 7 judges, 7 sisters, 7 fires. And just when it seems like an interesting coincidence, the same number appears in the layout of temples, pyramids, and mythic genealogies. This is where archaeologists usually step away from the conversation. Because once you see the pattern, it forces you to ask a question that traditional history is not equipped to handle. Did ancient civilizations around the world inherit their foundational knowledge from the same group of beings? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. The Sumerians thought so. The Egyptians thought so. The Vedic scholars thought so. The Maya thought so. The Dogon thought so. The Hopi thought so. The Inca thought so. And these cultures didn't just believe it, they built their cities, calendars, rituals, and entire identities around the return of these beings. And then another detail emerges, one that links nearly all ancient civilizations to a single moment, a global cataclysm, a flood, a massive disruption in the timeline. Whatever happened, it forced groups of survivors to restart civilization in multiple regions. But instead of beginning from zero, they began with guidance, because every flood myth includes a teacher who arrives afterward, a being who instructs the survivors on agriculture, stonework, writing, or astronomy. And almost every culture identifies that being as one of the same figures described in Sumerian tradition, under different names, but the same roles, the same attributes, the same mission. It becomes difficult to believe this is coincidence when the stories match too closely. In the Andes, Viracocha emerges after a catastrophe to teach humanity. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl arrives after a flood and gives agriculture and mathematics. In Sumer, Enki warns of the coming flood and preserves knowledge through select individuals. In Egypt, Thoth records the mysteries so they can be restored after the waters recede. In India, Manu survives with the guidance of a divine messenger. These are not vague similarities. These are specific sequences that align across continents. And then there's the architecture. Ancient cultures somehow build monumental structures with the same engineering concepts: pyramids, trilithons, cyclopean stonework, polygonal walls. They use identical joining techniques, identical astronomical orientations, identical symbolic carvings. Civilizations that never met somehow share the same blueprint. And the older the structures are, the more advanced they appear. This is the opposite of what we should find unless a shared influence shaped them, a shared teacher, a shared memory, or a shared presence. The story of humanity begins to look less like a slow evolution and more like a supervised project, one that begins suddenly, advances rapidly, and then stabilizes after the teachers withdraw. And then comes the strangest pattern of all. When these beings withdraw, humanity doesn't forget them. They wait for them. They align temples to their return points. They create calendars tracking celestial cycles. They encode long-term astronomical markers into stone. The Maya track a cycle of 5,125 years. The Vedic texts describe cycles far longer, and the Sumerian tablets reference a long orbital period associated with the beings who descended from above, not as superstition, but as the reason kingship was lowered from heaven. The deeper you go, the more it looks like ancient civilizations were not simply worshiping imaginary beings. They were documenting memories of instructors who shaped their earliest societies and then left. And the farther we dig into our past, the more it looks like they expected these beings to return. Because civilizations don't build their largest structures for legends. They build them for something they considered real, something powerful, something that shaped their destiny, something they feared and revered, and something they anticipated would one day come back. All around the world, at the foundations of ancient cultures, we find the same message. Humanity was taught, guided, shaped, and then left to grow, but not abandoned. Watched, observed, evaluated. Every civilization that traces its origins to the gods also describes a moment when the gods depart. But they never say, the gods disappeared. They say the gods withdrew. They stepped back. They watched from a distance. And the final detail these cultures share is perhaps the most unsettling of all. Because they didn't just expect a return. They predicted it. If the Anunnaki shaped the earliest civilizations, then the story of humanity is not one of isolated development. It is a story of intervention, a story of acceleration, a story of guidance, and a story paused, not concluded. The ancient world encoded this truth in stone because they believed that one day humanity would need to remember where it came from and why its civilizations began with knowledge far too advanced for their time. And if the teachers return, the question is not whether humanity will recognize them, but whether we will understand the role they played in shaping everything we call civilization.